So everyone, this is our moderator. This is Brian Ellison, who will begin moderating at this time.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Doris, and welcome everybody to this workshop. This is, as Doris said, the third in a series planned by the APSI Diversity Task Force for this year's event. Those first two, which by the way are not prerequisites, so don't worry if you missed them, you can still get a lot out of this one. We're focused on having difficult conversations and making difficult decisions. Today, we're moving from conversations and decisions to taking action, and the presenting topic today will be action around economic justice. My name is Brian Ellison. I'm the executive director of the Covenant Network of Presbyterians, which is a group that has been about, especially in recent years, helping the PCUSA move from its difficult decisions to taking difficult actions around inclusion. But on today's topic, I'm just the moderator. Our real experts are the ones on the panel and also our teacher, the Reverend Paul Roberts, who will close us with a few minutes of teaching and help us connect with resources and ways to think about this that will help us continue the exploration in our own contexts. But we're going to begin today with the panel, and I'm going to invite them to introduce themselves to us by taking a few minutes to answer a question, each of them. And so let me put them all on the screen with me here. And as you heard from June Lorenzo, she will join us on screen when she's able to do that. But let's start with the Reverend Dr. Alonzo Johnson, who is coordinator for the Presbyterian Committee on the Self-Development of People with the PCUSA. Dr. Johnson, when we talk about working for meaningful change or bringing economic justice, a lot of us are having that conversation in the context of churches or communities where many of us are white, many of us are affluent, we're in institutions that are infused with white supremacy and paternalistic ideas and history. So my question is, how do we keep our engagement from reflecting those outdated and damaging values and having a real impact?
Thank you, Brian. Part of being, first of all, good afternoon to everyone. It's good to be here with you and to have this time together to do God's work together. And that's to really have substantive conversations about what does it mean to take action and to do what God calls us to do. Brian, that's a powerful question. One of the things that I think is important for us to understand is that we have to move away from what is considered to be white supremacy culture when we talk about economic justice, right? And so what I mean by that is I'm going to borrow from the authors Tema Okun and Kenneth Jones, who talk about the characteristics of white supremacy culture, one being paternalism, right? Moving away from this idea that somehow not only do we own everything, but we can determine what's best for everyone. Right, we move away from these kind of ideas of perfection, paternalism, the superhero model of doing ministry. Right, we're going to come and we're going to save the day. Right, we're going to come, we're going to make you whole. That somehow, and that is a real integral part of the discussion is how do we move away from that type of mission work? How do we move away from the paternalism? Characteristics of white supremacy culture. Economic justice is a lot about righteousness, right? It's doing what is right and what is equitable, right? And in doing that, it's about creating relationships. One of the most powerful things about the self-development of people ministries, which I am incredibly honored to be a part of, is that we were born out of the concern for reparations, right? This ministry came out of a concern of communities that were not able to have voice and access, but were communities that were definitely able to solve and handle the issues that are going on around them. And so, and I'll spare you all the historical details, but James Foreman being invited to the General Assembly in San Antonio in 1969 basically laid the Presbyterian Church out and said that you owe money to Black communities. In these conversations, self-development of people was born. Out of the concern for reparations, out of the concern for who gets to make decisions. And it was understanding that our communities are folks who get to make decisions. Our communities know best. And so when the work we do with self-development of people, a lot of it is understanding what the communities have to teach us as the church, and not necessarily the other way around, right? So relationships is really key for that. And understanding, and I think it also goes to our understanding of poverty, right? I was doing a workshop not too long ago, and someone said to me, so speak about the cultures of poverty. And the only way I can answer him was to say, well, we can't talk about cultures of poverty if we're not going to talk about cultures of oppression, right? And so moving away from these paternalistic ideas of cultures of poverty, toxic charity, and these kinds of things that are not taking in accord the power of communities and the power of relationships, right? So taking action in that sense, and economic justice and white supremacy is understanding how do we move away from these characteristics of white supremacy. Mission that is one-sided, mission that only speaks to itself, mission that does not listen closely. Paul Tillich, the theologian, said the first act of love is listening, right? How do we listen? And I think that those particular types of things are really important. I constantly think about the book Decolonizing Wealth from Edgar Villanueva, who talks about this, right? How do we decolonize our understanding of mission? How do we decolonize our understanding of doing God's work? In those spiritual practices, right, we're reminded that this is about Jesus, who says to us, I come to bring the good news. I come to set captives free, to bring power to the poor. Matthew 25, we have a God that is not concerned about doing this as an elective, right? This is about being integral to who we are as God's people. So that moves us away from this idea of superheroism, right? We're going to go save cultures, and brings us closer to what does it mean to create relationships so that we can understand what is best. And sometimes, I think there's something about reciprocity in this, that we too are also moved. And that's the power, I think, of SDOP. The work that we've been doing is how do we listen to a plethora, an amalgam of different communities who are addressing issues of trafficking, addressing issues of homelessness, addressing issues of you name it. And these are the communities that are engaged, and they're teaching us, and we're listening so that we know our place in this work.
Thank you so much. That is a really helpful place to start, I think. And we'll dig into a lot of those things you shared, especially this idea of listening, I think. What does that mean to listen? How do we listen in a way that's meaningful? But let me turn to another of our panelists. And this is June, who's joining us audio only for now. Dr. June Lorenzo is a judge and human rights advocate, a member of the General Assembly Permanent Judicial Commission, and very active in the Presbyterian Church's work. And June, one of the areas where you have worked is in education around the doctrine of discovery, about the and also about the status of Native American churches and the broader church community. I wonder if you would talk a little bit about how you've invited others into meaningful action, and how they how they learn from you and from others to shake the colonial mindset in which our church has so often existed, and take meaningful action toward justice. And June, you I think are on mute, so.
Okay, can you hear me? Can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good, I'm glad. Good morning, everyone. Kawatsi Hopa, Yaat Eh, in the languages of my parents. I'm speaking to you from the territory of Laguna Pueblo, which we've been fortunate to be in despite, 500 years of fighting for it. So luckily, we're not a people that have been removed from our territory. So greetings from Laguna Pueblo. So you asked me how to invite others into meaningful action. Well, sort of like the first speaker talked about, I think it's, action can be thinking and rethinking. And a lot of the work I do around Native American ministry in the church and education around the doctrine of discovery is really rethinking, undoing, unlearning a lot of what we've inherited. Even Native people, because we've all been in the same education system, we've all been in the same church, and really looking at our history and our institutions with new eyes, And so I think meaningful action, in my experience of working with the church, has really been rethinking that which we assume. And one of course, I mean, one example is, you know, as I've said to people, I'm about a 6th or 7th generation Presbyterian, as far as I can tell. But I wouldn't be a Presbyterian if it weren't for some missionaries and the church that decided in the, you know, the mid 1800s that, you know, my dad's people were uncivilized, or they didn't know Christ and they didn't know God, and they needed to be Christianized, right? So that, you know, that is why the majority, by far, the majority of Native Presbyterians in our denomination are Presbyterians. And so so how do we look at that? And when you have that sort of legacy, what assumptions do people make about what, you know, whether we're on equal footing? I mean, we've been, for so much of our history with the church, we've been objects of ministry instead of partners in ministry. And so how do we rethink a whole different relationship? The other taking action besides rethinking and educating is related to one of the most difficult decisions. And when we talk about reparations, is some people have this, you know, they don't think about the history behind their church, like what territory was their church on. And a few churches in our denomination have really looked at this and said, where did we get this land for the church? What is the history behind this land? Whose territory was it originally on? Or where do our church campsites or places like that, whose territory did they begin to? What's the history about how it came into the church's hands? And I think so, you know, inviting folks into doing different relationships, into relearning what we've learned and what we've assumed for so long. And then, of course, you know, the Presbyterian church, we have great resources now. We have a report on the doctrine of discovery. We have a long list of recommendations about how to do meaningful relationships with Native communities, even if they're not Presbyterian communities. So I think we have a lot of resources already within our denomination for ideas. There are so many things we can do. And I would just say, let's look at our resources. And another one of those things is really looking at our confessions. Do our confessions really speak to a partnering relationship? Do our confessions, any of them, make assumptions about the other and about, you know, people who are not Christian or people who are not white? So I think there's plenty of work to do, and for all interests, for all level of interest. So I think I'll stop there for now.
I appreciate that, June. Thank you. I really appreciate the idea that rethinking our assumptions is an action and a necessary one. And that's a helpful place to launch our conversation as well. Let me introduce the third member of our panel. Reverend Andrew Connors is pastor of Brown Memorial Presbyterian Church in Baltimore. He's also co-chair of Baltimoreans United in Leadership Development, BUILD, and can tell us a little bit about that. In fact, I want to ask you about that, Andrew. A great deal of your ministry has been devoted to your community organizing efforts there. Talk about BUILD and specifically what it has meant for you as a white church pastor to be engaging in this interfaith, multiracial community organizing work.
Thank you, Brian. And it's great to be on this panel with such esteemed guests. So the BUILD organization is part of the Industrial Areas Foundation, which is the oldest and largest community organizing network in the US. It was founded at the tail end of the civil rights movement by leaders in the Black church in Baltimore who were really concerned that coming to the tail end of the civil rights movement, we needed a better strategy for developing leaders within their own communities to be able to articulate what their own needs were, what the own oppression was that they were facing, and then to organize power together to create change. And BUILD has had some storied successes over the past 45 years. It was the first organization to coin the phrase the living wage and created the first living wage ordinance in the country that the organization's very proud of, the largest after school program in the city. Turnaround Tuesday, which is a employment program, which has now helped over 800 unemployed Baltimoreans find living wage work, 60% of whom are returning citizens, and also negotiated one of the largest community benefits agreements in the country, going up against Under Armour and Kevin Plank here in Baltimore, and extracting, I think, more for the community than we've ever seen in most community benefits agreements. So specifically your question, Brian, what does it mean for me as a white pastor to be engaging with this community organizing network? It's a number of things. I mean, it's a deeply spiritual kind of community for me. I think Dr. Johnson quoted Paul Tillich earlier about listening, and I'm fond of quoting Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who said the death of the spiritual life begins when we stop listening. And it's in this community where I have deeply listened to people in communities that are not my own, by background, by race, by economics, by gender, by sexual orientation, to understand people's struggles, or at least better understand them than I did before the listening. And then to be in a kind of group that really believes in collective action. Again, quoting Dr. Johnson again, getting away from the superhero mentality. There's nothing that I have been a part of in Baltimore that's been significant that I've done by myself. Absolutely nothing. And I think that is sort of the opposite of the colonial model, which would say I can go anywhere, do anything, take anything, decide anything that I want, which is not only an oppressive kind of assumption, but is also long-term, it doesn't produce the results that it promises. So I think that kind of collective action has been significant. The other thing I would say is just, I'd push back on you a little bit, Brian. I don't think there's a way for any of us to completely extract ourselves from white supremacy culture at this point in time in history. And in fact, I think part of the work is about learning each and every day to identify those parts of our own activity which are contributing to that culture and which parts are helping to dismantle it. And I think that kind of a posture then ensures that our motivations aren't about our own self-image or the self-image of our institutions, but are actually creating different outcomes. And I think ultimately in Baltimore, which is a city of approximately 60% Black city that is hyper segregated, whose problems are the direct result of white supremacist policies and culture, oppression over generations, that ensures that we really keep our focus not on ourselves, but again, on those outcomes, on doing things differently so that we have different outcomes. And I think that has been important for me from an ethical standpoint to think about the motivation for our work to be about what we produce together in terms of different outcomes.
Thank you so much, Andrew. And I want to invite our panel to respond to one another if they heard things from each other that triggered thoughts or ideas in them. As they do that, I want to invite all of you in the workshop. If you have questions for the panel, I'd love to work your questions into the conversation. You can put them in the chat box. If you'd rather they be not have your name attached to them, you can send them privately to me in the chat box, and we'll work them into the conversation either way. Any responses to one another? Do you want to piggyback on each other's thoughts at all? And I'll apologize that June, you'll have to be especially proactive in charging into the conversation since I can't see your face.
Okay, well then I'll be, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so hearing from the other two panelists reminds me of something that I think it's a lesson that's really important, I think, for everyone. In a time when people want to do something and, the church wants to do things, I've in the human rights work that I do, a lot of the nonprofits or small communities, they're seeking grants and so on, and they've been oppressed for so long, and they want to do things about this, and so when they get grants, they have to oftentimes the organizations who give the grants, they want to see results, and right, it's like a 1-year grant, a 2-year grant, and we're talking at least for indigenous peoples like 500 years of oppression, and they want to see results in one grant cycle or 2 grant cycles, which is really difficult. But it also applies to Christian people who want to do something, who want to help. I think we have, and I'm gonna, I'll listen to pushback, but it's kind of an arrogance, and I think all of us kind of are guilty of it, in that like, oh, I want to help this community, but really I want to see the results of my work. I want to be able to say that our church did this and look how things changed, right? When the reality is, at least I can speak for indigenous peoples, that I may not see the kind of change I want in my lifetime, but I have to know that I'm doing my part during my lifetime because generations of people before me have done their part. And so it's almost something we have to let go of, and let go of that expectation to see things change because of our actions, at least we can see in a grant cycle or even in our lifetime. So the other comments inspired me just to share that thinking about helping others.
Thank you, June. That's really helpful. Let me pose another question to all of you, and really to flesh out something that a couple of you mentioned, this colonial model. And Andrew, I think you defined it as the idea that that those with privilege and power can decide whatever they want, take whatever they want. Flesh out the difference between a colonial model of problem solving, of addressing issues in a community, and a model that would truly emerge from the community itself. That's what the community organizing work you do, Andrew, is about. It's what the self-development of people work that you do, Alonzo, is about. Help us make that distinction. How would the work look different in a colonial model versus a community-based and driven model?
That's a great question, Brian. And this is really connecting with June. It's, a colonial model is something that is, as June mentioned, look at what we've done, right? It is about, lifting up ourselves and not so much doing this work or making relationships or connecting with communities. It's more about valor, right? Look how good we are. We are good people. This is about, absolving ourselves of any sense of guilt. And I think, and also this idea that, again, it's the characteristics of white supremacy culture, perfection and lack of discomfort. We don't like to be uncomfortable. We like to do this work and it's seamless and they're happy, we're happy, and it looks great. And I think that, we distinguish this work by understanding several things, that, this is not about results right away and the kinds of results that we're looking for. Ministry is risk. And I think that there's those relationship building is risk. It's discomfort. These fly right in the face of the characteristics of white supremacy. It is not perfect. One of the things that's really powerful is that some years ago, when I was pastoring a church, we did what is now called Family Promise, but then it was a network to take in families that were seeking, homes. And I remember, one of the families saying, don't expect me to sit here and thank you all night. Don't expect me to, what do you want me to do? You eat your food and say thank you, and that makes you feel better? And it was real. This is not about, shining up our egos, right? This is, and there's a distinction. Distinction is, it's not about us, right? It's not about us. We're not called to do this work to make ourselves look good. to make ourselves look holy. And if it was about us, we're really doing a crappy job, right? It's not about us. It is about doing the work of God. And that means in many ways that, I think a lot of Ella Baker, who, is in the background of the civil rights movement, but is one of the engines of the movement, Black woman, engines of the movement, but is in the background, a name that may not have been as well known. But it's this idea that it's not about us. And I think that's one of the distinctions between what we do and white supremacy culture. This is not about putting gold stars on us and all the great things we did. This is about following Jesus and recognizing that a community might call us out, that someone might call us out, that someone might tell the truth on us, that someone might say to us, the church has been lacking, the church is racist, the church is sexist, and be right on point. It means people telling the truth. And we can't, again, that's a discomfort. We don't want to be uncomfortable, and I think those are some of the things that we see that differentiates, doing action in communal sense as opposed to a colonial or neo-colonial sense.
That's helpful. Thank you. Anyone else on that?
Yeah, I agree. And I just, the way I think about sort of a non-colonial model is, first of all, we're talking about power. And I think churches have to figure out, how do we have more conversations about power? I think some churches often want to avoid, I saw the comment in the chat about politics. Churches want to try to avoid those conversations as if we can create this mythical, otherworldly space where our own actions aren't, as Dr. King said, inextricably connected to one another. So to be the church is to engage with power. And the question is going to be, in what way are we going to do that? So for me, as a white pastor in a historically white institution, I think it's really important that the power be governed by relationships that are about communities that are more than just communities that look like my predominantly white community, or culturally are similar to my community, which sometimes can cross racial lines. So I think that's the conversation I'd like to have with people, is how are we engaging power? It doesn't mean that we're not going to mess up. The other piece that's been helpful for me from organizing is to think about sort of roughly 3 areas of ministry or action. One is listening, one is action, and one is evaluation and reflection. And I think about myself, and then I think about communities. Where's our sweet spot? Where do we tend to spend more time? Some communities are only about listening to one another, and that never translates into taking risks, like Dr. Johnson said, getting into the mix of things, trying things out to create change, either within an institution or within a larger community. Some are so busy with action all the time that they've kind of lost sight of, I think, evaluating, has this been effective? Or is it turned into, again, I keep quoting Dr. Johnson, but the valor of a particular community, the image of a community, we're so progressive or we're so missional or whatever, you fill in the blank. And then some, I think, do sort of overanalyze and critique every single action such that they find themselves, again, reluctant to take risks because they recognize that every action that we take is going to come with some difficulty, downside, or critique. And I like to find kind of the mix between those 3 things so that we're taking risks. Yes, sometimes we're making mistakes. And yes, we're able to call each other out and have deep conversations about when were times that we participated in perpetuating systems of oppression, and when were times where we actually created some movement in directions that are more just and more hopeful. And I just think that kind of a dynamic community is what I hope for, certainly for myself, but for others too. And then the last thing I would just want to say is that I've really been captured by Dr. Ibram Kendi's work, his big book, Stamped from the Beginning, The History of Racist Ideas in America. And he basically argues in there at the end, in the epilogue, that it is actually in all of our self-interests to create anti-racist institutions, anti-racist actions, if you look historically. So I don't want predominantly white communities to walk away with the idea that anti-racist action is somehow this altruistic missional stance that leads us back to the paternalism that I think Dr. Johnson named at the very beginning, but rather it is about our corporate liberation and the community that we're trying to create together. Now, it affects us in different ways. I don't want to overstate that, but I don't want to lose sight of that either.
Appreciate that. June, I see you unmuted. Do you want to add?
Yeah, and I say this with all love for our church, but you know, our church, our polity, which you know some people love, our church really has a colonial model of structure, and either folks can hide in that and create more colonial minded structures, or folks can do things in spite of it. And that's, you know, I know that it does clearly not, the way of doing relationship, the way of doing things clearly doesn't reflect a lot of communities of color. And so oftentimes, from what I've heard, listened, experienced over my years of working nationally with the church, is people often get things not because of our structure, but in spite of our structure. And, you know, we're in a way, you know, many of us are so wedded to our church structure. I think it really, you know, either we find ways, and I've seen, you know, our church is full of brilliant minds and ways to make, you know, to decolonize our church structure and to do things in spite of it. I think we have to really look inside and look at ourselves. And I'm going to give one example that comes to mind that I'm familiar with. So years ago, in the Southwest, a number of tribes were working to get some protection for a sacred landscape, sacred mountain that was being threatened by uranium mining. And under the legislation, under the laws that affected it, private landowners that had property on the mountain could opt in or to support. And so, you know, I went to my presbytery and asked for a letter of support. And so they used the committee system to send it to the property committee, and it, you know, and it just stayed there, didn't get out. So, you know, eventually I just went to the national church, and wonderful, you know, Mr. Kirkpatrick did this beautiful letter on PCUSA stationery to support it. But, you know, we all know that if you know, want to slow down something, you send it to a committee. And so I never got support from the presbytery. You know, it was difficult. And I mean, I think there were conflicts of interest, because I think attorneys who were within some of the larger, more affluent churches in the presbytery were counsel to some of the mining companies that wanted to mine. So what do you do with that, right? Were the concerns equally heard, or did it just get stuck in committee? I mean, that's just a question that I want to leave there.
Great contributions. I really appreciate it. I
Can I
want
respond to that?
Oh,
Can I
quickly, yeah, please.
Thank you for that, June. I'm a big fan of the Peter Drucker quote that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And I do think that what June has raised is this question of what is our culture, or what are our cultures, if you want to get more into it. And shifting cultures are much more difficult than taking sort of isolated actions. And I think it takes a longer period of time, and it does require a deeper kind of organizing, which includes deep relationships where people have the chance to dream about what would we like our relationships to look like with each other, and then take some actions that are going to feel difficult for people, some people who have relied on the existing structures for their own comfort if I'm generous, and for their own benefit if I'm a little more critical. And I think there's probably a little bit of both in that. But those are difficult. That's a difficult kind of change.
Yeah. So a lot of questions that are coming in the chat that I really want to kind of wrap up into maybe one big question for all of you. The questions get at the idea of first steps. You know, we're talking about some pretty big ideas, and the more we talk, I'm gonna mute. Okay, I think we've got that taken care of. The more we talk, the more ominous and imposing this idea seems, I think. How can we possibly make any progress? How can we do anything? You know, we've talked about the importance of listening as a first step, but in order to listen, you have to be in a relationship. You have to have someone to listen to, and you have to be able to listen to one another across lines of division or distrust that may be historically embedded. So I guess the question is, you know, for this group of folks who are listening today, what are the first steps you can take? Especially, someone asks, if you find yourself in a community where you know there's resistance to even broach the subject, how do you begin building relationships and start this process of taking action?
I want to answer that by, I want to connect with something that June mentioned about, June, you talked about the uranium piece. There's an organization called MACE, right? Multicultural Alliance for a Safe Environment. Is that?
And I'm a member of that.
Okay, so here's the connection. SDOP, we funded them to fight that very issue.
Yes.
And here's the issue here too. And so first steps, the bee in my bonnet sometimes is that the first steps is your church. The first step is the fact that you got people in your denomination that do this work. The first steps, if I'm in Baltimore and someone asks me, what are the first steps? I would say you talk to Reverend Andrew Connors, make those connections with those who are doing it. That's the thing too. You asked earlier, Brian, about this connection or how do we separate, you know, from colonial ideology. One of them is recognizing we don't know everything. The Presbyterians don't know everything, and that we make those connections with those folks who are doing it. And you know, and it's very simple. When you give, and I hate this to be a commercial for One Great Hour Sharing, but it's real. When you give to One Great Hour Sharing, this is what your work does. And helping people understand that they may already be taking the first step. When they're giving to a national, you know, they're giving to the national church, they may already be taking a first step when they are supporting these things. Like, they're not giving to us because it's our pet projects. You know, SDOP, you know, the ministries of the church are an extension of their hands into the world. And when they know more about the fact that, wow, I'm doing this work through these organizations, they may already be taking the first step. The other thing is be open to learning, asking questions, you know, connecting with people, making that call, right? It's making a call to Reverend Connors. It's making a call to June. And I think that these are the kinds of things that, you know, again, moving away from this idea of perfectionism and lack of comfort, and saying, hey, we don't know. And that's one of the most, I think, the three powerful words about ministry is that we don't know. And I think that that's, you know, but it's the bee in my bonnet is that, you know, that you have the resources. You know, you have the resources in print, you have the resources in people that are there. And we're here. You know, I mean, we're here for you. We're here to walk with you in the church. We're here to say, hey, if you're concerned about public education, we have an initiative, Educate a Child, Transform the World. You know, letting folks know that the first step is basically, you know, it's like admitting you have a problem. The first step is admitting, like, okay, we need to find out more about this. Where does our money go when we give to the church? And first, and recognizing that we may already be in it, stepping in it and what we do, and to embrace that. And so I think that's really important, and to make those connections that we, you know, we are connected and that work is connected, and stop being, I think one of the things, I'll say this and I'll shut up. One of the things that's really interesting that I found, like I was at Target the other day, right? And all the books in Target are all the books that Presbyterians are reading, right? All of them, all the books on race. And I thought, you know, here I am in Target. I never thought I'd see the day that all these books would make it on the shelf. And the reality is that, yeah, they're great to read, but just like Reverend Connors was saying, it's good to talk to yourselves and read, but if you're not stepping out, those books mean nothing, because many of them, if I'm not mistaken, all of them, and having read most of them, are like, okay, so what's going to be your next point of action? How are you going to make those relationships be risky? How do you recognize that you have the resources within you already in your churches? You may be connected to the resources. And so those things are really important, is understanding, how to take that first step. And maybe you're already in the first step by supporting what you support.
Anyone else? Yes, the next action step after reading those books for a lot of us seems to be to read the next book on the reading list. And that's any other answers to that? First steps, ways you cultivate the relationships to build the listening?
Well, for me, I have experienced, I spent 11 years in National Capital Presbyterian. I was part of the anti-racism training team. And we went to churches where I knew folks because of Presbyterian committees and things like that. And, I had people say, well, I'm not guilty for the sins of my ancestors, end of conversation. And I've had people say to me, well, why are you talking about this doctrine of discovery? It's like hundreds of years old. What does it have to do with my life today? Or I've had people say, why don't you just be American like everyone else? You lost the war. So I've heard, well-meaning people say things like this. And so honestly, I've encountered such levels of resistance, and, it's so embedded, these ideas. And this is, for me, this is the place where white allies can come in, white allies that can speak with them and have maybe a different conversation than I could. And I've learned over the years about the importance of white allies. This is very important in the work. Some, people can have conversations that I cannot. It's happened in my own presbytery. I've seen resistance to anti-racism training, and white allies have stepped in to take the leadership in starting conversations and holding conversations informally and formally. So to me, that's one critical piece that I've learned in the work that I've done. So I'm just going to speak to that piece.
Thanks, June.
I would just add to what Judge Lorenzo said. I think it really depends. I mean, it depends on your context. It depends on where you are in some of this work. I'm obviously very biased in listening, and in our organizing training, we spend a lot of time teaching people how to listen, which sounds kind of like, really, like, we're Christians, we should know how to listen, but actually most of us don't. And I think our culture is set up to be much more transactional. It's much more fast paced. It's much more about platforms and but to actually sit down with someone one-to-one and really listen, I think, is a different discipline. And that's where I think this is where it's deeply connected for me with the spiritual life and spiritual work. If we can approach other people with this listening posture, that I don't know everything, that I don't make assumptions about someone's life, that I really want to know who they are, that's actually the way that you begin to build the relationships that are needed to move on some of these bigger political questions. I was listening to an organizer the other day. He just wrote a book and had a book release. And I asked him what was, anything about his disciplines that he had learned. And he said, the only thing that I can think of that I was consistent about is that I tried every day to take an hour and a half lunch, which was surprising to me because this is someone who was like in action all the time. And he said, the way I used that lunch was to think about the conversations, individual meetings I'd had in the morning, and then to think about the conversations I was preparing for in the afternoon and reset my brain so that I wasn't there to get something from them, but I was really there to understand who they were, who they are. And I wonder about how ministry would change and the colonial models would change if we learned about that kind of posture, even inside our own institutions. instead of this transactional nature of ministry, which is about, I've already decided what my agenda is. I've already decided what needs to happen. And now I'm going to go recruit people for my agenda. That's the kind of overhaul that I'd like to see in the church, both internally and externally.
This has been an amazing conversation. I cannot believe how time has flown, but we actually are at the end of the panel time in the workshop. Only scratching the surface, of course, but that's what these workshops are for. They're designed to begin a conversation that we continue on in our lives and our places of ministry. I want to thank Reverend Dr. Alonzo Johnson, Dr. June Lorenzo, and Reverend Andrew Connors for being on the panel. Thanks to all of you. And now let me invite to close our time, the Reverend Paul Roberts, who is president of Johnson C. Smith Theological Seminary, already has blessed this conference with his preaching, but will bless us now in this workshop with his teaching about how we can continue this conversation and things to think about as takeaways from this look at taking action. Reverend Roberts.
Thank you, Brian. And thank you, panelists. Thank you, June, Alonzo, and Andrew. Your expertise and depth of knowledge are really important, and your conversation was extremely effective and meaningful to me. Lots of amazing themes to pick up on, and I'm not going to attempt to do that. Instead, well, actually, there is at the tail end of that conversation, and I think this is Dr. June's thread, but I am going to pick up a little bit on the resistance factor. But what I want to do is, in part because of the feedback that I received from the sermon yesterday, I just want to talk around and about the sermon, not rehash the content of the sermon, but talk around it. I feel like we have arrived at a point where there is real enthusiasm and excitement, agitation, maybe, excuse me one second. I'm sorry, excuse me. Okay, thank you. There's kind of this mindset that we're ready to go. And yes, that's important. That's important for Presbyterian. That's important. And by the way, Alonzo, we don't know everything. Oh, that you said that was like. So, there's this sense that we have a lot of knowledge and now we're fired up and ready to roll. But the thing is, it's one thing to be in a conference setting or be on the mountaintop, the proverbial mountaintop, and ready to roll. And it's a much different thing to be on the ground or in the valley, where the rubber meets the road. And so the sermon yesterday was an effort to theologize around what is repair. And we started this, our panel, distinguished panel, started this conversation using the word reparation. There is a theological framing around the whole notion and work of reparation. And my concern is that despite our energy and our spoken commitment to getting in there and making a difference, that we don't have a solid enough theological grounding to do this. And so the sermon yesterday was an effort to lead people to think theologically about repair, not simply to push them to a point of being ready to jump in there, but to think theologically about repair and all of its derivatives, what it looks like on the ground. And one of the motivating factors for that sermon is actually in the Beljar Confession, the Confession of 1967, all of which I think Presbyterians ought to be revisiting on the regular. But then there is also the Accra Confession. And I would lift that up and recommend to any of us who are in this conversation, if we're not familiar with the Accra Confession, that we avail ourselves immediately. And I'm going to read a couple of sections from the Accra Confession. In the early going, it reads as follows. The signs of the times have become more alarming and must be interpreted. The root causes of massive threats to life are, above all, the product of an unjust economic system, defended and protected by political and military might. Economic systems are a matter of life or death. That is just incredibly impactful to me on a personal note. And until I read that and saw that stated so concisely in print, I'm not sure I'd ever really processed justice through the lens of the economies of justice. So the confession goes on making a really important case, and it builds to a crescendo, and part of the crescendo reads as follows. We humbly confess this hope, knowing that we stand under the judgment of God's justice. So we acknowledge the complicity and guilt of those who consciously or unconsciously benefit from the current neoliberal economic global system. We recognize that this includes both churches and members of our own Reformed family, and therefore we call for a confession of sin. We acknowledge that we have become captivated by the culture of consumerism and the competitive greed and selfishness of the current economic system. This has all too often permeated our very spirituality. We confess our sin in misusing creation and failing to play our role as stewards and companions of nature. We confess our sin that our disunity within the Reformed family has impaired our ability to serve God's mission in fullness. And so I read these statements, right? And I'm thinking, here are 1,000 Presbyterians at APSI who are ready to rock and roll. And these 1,000 Presbyterians are going to go back to their congregations. And as you have pointed out, Dr. June, they are going to start doing this work, try to figure out where to jump in. And one of the first things that's going to happen, they will meet with resistance. And then what? When we're in a community of like-minded, it's good, but where the rubber meets the road, the everyday reality, they're going to hit the wall, and they're going to hit it fast. And one way to stand tall and stand strong when we meet the resistance is to have a firm theological grounding. And that's what we find in Isaiah 58, I think. And that's what we find other places, especially in the Old Testament, to me. The whole notion of Jubilee, that the season in which all debts are forgiven. You know, embedded in that idea is a theological grounding that stays the people and supports the people in the face of resistance. And so as time's almost up, but as we move into more serious action steps, I am loath to do that. As important as that is, I am loath to do that without significant theological preparation. And that, I think, is an important step, as has been stated. Rethinking is a step, re-educating is a step, relearning, those are all steps. And I think this work of building a theological grounding is an important first step. So time's up.
Well, Reverend Roberts, thank you so much for those words. Thanks again to our panelists, Dr. Johnson, Reverend Connors, Dr. Lorenzo. What a rich time this hour has been. I feel like we got about 4 hours of content in the last hour, and more to do, more to learn. But I am so truly grateful. Grateful to all of you for being part of it as well. Thanks for your attention and your caring about these details, about these important matters in the life of our church, life of our country, and in our spiritual lives as well. I am deeply grateful for each of you. Friends, we have 15 seconds left. I'd like to close us in prayer, if you'll allow me to do that. Let us pray. Eternal God, you speak to us with powerful and challenging words coming from the lips of these sisters and brothers, siblings in Christ. Convict us, move us, empower us. Let us take not only the first steps, but the steps after that, so that your justice, your love, your goodness might prevail in our church and in our world. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.